Alright, listen closely. I've got a story to tell you that'll make your skin crawl. It's about a man, Lonnie Franklin Jr., who would become infamous as the Grim Sleeper, a serial killer who preyed on vulnerable young women in South Central Los Angeles. Lonnie was born August 30th, 1952, in the heart of South LA. He grew up in a tough neighborhood, where crime and violence were a way of life. His early years were marked by poverty and neglect, but he managed to turn his life around long enough to join the U.S. Army in 1971. However, his military career was short-lived. Franklin was discharged from the Army in 1975 after being involved in a gang rape case in Germany. Though the details of his discharge remain unclear, he was sent back to the U.S. and released from service. Now, here's where things take a dark turn. In 1984, a young woman named Laura Moore was shot 6 times at a bus stop by a man who would later be revealed as Lonnie Franklin Jr. But what's remarkable about this story is that Moore managed to escape and identify her attacker. Can you imagine being shot 6 times and still having the strength to turn back and look your attacker in the eye? The pattern of women disappearing from South Central LA began in 1985, with at least 10 confirmed victims over the next decade. They were all young, poor, and black, mostly prostitutes or drug users who lived on the margins of society. Their bodies would be found dumped in alleyways or garbage bags, often with bullet wounds or strangulation marks. What makes this case stand out is that the killer seemed to take a 14-year break between his last murder in 1988 and his first victim in 2002. It was as if he'd gone into hiding, waiting for the perfect moment to strike again. You're at the Unseen Circle, and this is the full story of the Grim Sleeper. The Grim Sleeper had a very specific modus operandi when it came to choosing his victims. He targeted young black women living in poverty, often those who were struggling with addiction or prostitution. They were vulnerable, easy prey for a predator like him. The pattern emerged early on in the killing spree, which began in mid-1980s. Franklin would cruise around South Central LA, looking for potential victims. He'd often park his car near bus stops or liquor stores, where he knew women would be most likely to approach him. He'd strike up a conversation, pretend to be friendly and interested in them, and then lure them into his car with promises of money for sex. One of the early victims was 29-year-old Deborah Jackson, who was found shot to death on August 10, 1985. Another victim was 34-year-old Henrietta Wright, who was discovered dead just 2 days later. What's chilling is that both women were shot with a .25 caliber gun, which would become the signature weapon of the Grim Sleeper. The early murders seemed to follow a similar pattern. Franklin would take his victims to a secluded location, where he'd shoot them in the head or strangle them. He'd then dump their bodies in alleyways or garbage bags, often leaving them for days before they were discovered. But here's what makes this case even more disturbing. Many of the victims had contact with Franklin before they died. Some of them had even seen him before, but they never suspected a thing. They thought he was just a friendly guy who'd buy them drinks or offer them rides home. One witness came forward to describe how Franklin would often bring prostitutes into his home. He'd have sex with them and then kill them afterwards. It's a sickening pattern of behavior that continued for years, with Franklin always staying one step ahead of the law. At first, the police thought they were dealing with a series of isolated crimes, a young woman here, another one there. They didn't connect the dots between the different victims or realize that they were all linked by a common thread. The police in South Central LA were already overwhelmed with gang violence and other types of crime. They didn't have the resources or the manpower to devote to a series of murders that seemed like just another day in the neighborhood. When the bodies started piling up, the police finally began to take notice. But they still didn't realize that they were dealing with a serial killer. They thought it might be a copycat or a gang member trying to send a message. It wasn't until 1986, when Henrietta Wright's body was found, that the police started to suspect that they had a serial killer on their hands. But even then, they didn't have enough evidence to make an arrest. The investigation was botched from the start. The police were under pressure from the community to solve the case quickly, but they were also hampered by a lack of resources and a lack of expertise in dealing with serial killers. The media didn't pick up on the story either. They were too focused on other crimes in LA at the time: gang violence, riots, and other types of mayhem. The Grim Sleeper killings just seemed like another day's work for the police. It wasn't until 1992 that the Los Angeles Times ran a front-page article about the grim sleeper killings. But even then, the article was buried on page A3 in the next day's paper. The public was not outraged by the murders. They were too used to violence and crime in LA to care about a few more bodies on the streets. Until 2007, when a new detective named Steve Zeidman took on the case, that things began to change. Zeidman was a dogged investigator who pored over old evidence and interviewed witnesses who'd been ignored for years. He finally connected the dots between the different victims and realized that they were all linked by a common thread. Lonnie Franklin Jr. It took him another 2 years to build enough evidence to make an arrest. The night Anitra Washington was attacked by the grim sleeper is forever etched in her memory. It's a night that would change her life forever. It started with a simple request for a ride home. Anitra had been out at a party and was tired, so she accepted the offer of a ride from a stranger. She got into his car without hesitation, thinking nothing of it. As they drove, the man began to chat her up, trying to make small talk. But Anitra could sense something was off about him. He seemed nervous and fidgety, constantly glancing in the rearview mirror. Before she knew what was happening, the man had pulled over on a deserted street. He told her they were at her stop, but Anitra knew that wasn't true. There was no house nearby, just a dark alleyway. That's when he attacked her. He jumped into the back seat and grabbed her, pulling her towards him. Anitra struggled to free herself, but she was pinned down by his weight. The next thing she remembers is feeling a searing pain in her chest. She had been shot at close range, the bullet piercing her lung and leaving her for dead. Anitra's vision began to blur, and she felt herself slipping away. But somehow, she managed to muster up enough strength to struggle free from the man's grasp. She crawled out of the car and stumbled onto the sidewalk. The last thing she remembers is seeing the man take a Polaroid photo of her as she lay there, bleeding and helpless. When Anitra came to, she was in a hospital bed, surrounded by doctors and nurses. She had no memory of how she got there or what had happened to her. It wasn't until months later that the police came to interview her about the attack. They showed her the Polaroid photo the man had taken, and Anitra recognized it immediately. She remembered every detail of the attack, from the feel of the man's hands on her skin to the sound of the gun firing. She remembered the way he looked at her, with a cold, calculating gaze that seemed to bore into her soul. Despite her vivid description of the attacker and his crimes, Anitra's case failed to lead to his capture. The police were slow to respond, and by the time they started investigating, the evidence had been destroyed. The Polaroid photo was never matched with any other crime scene, and the bullet that had nearly killed Anitra was lost in the system. It wasn't until decades later, when DNA technology became more advanced, that the police were able to link the crimes to a suspect. Lonnie Franklin Jr., the grim sleeper. Anitra's survival was a miracle, but it came at a great cost. She was left with physical and emotional scars that would haunt her for the rest of her life. But she never gave up, using her experience to become an advocate for victims' rights and a voice for those who had been silenced by their attackers. What makes this case so unusual, so deeply disturbing, is the supposed 14-year gap between Lonnie Franklin Jr.'s last known murder in 1988 and his next confirmed victim in 2002. Serial killers don't just stop. They either die, get arrested, or change their methods. And yet, for over a decade, it seemed like the grim sleeper had vanished into thin air. No more bodies dumped in alleys. No more women disappearing under the same circumstances. Nothing. So what happened? For years, law enforcement assumed Franklin had gone dormant. Maybe he got spooked when the LAPD formed the Southside Slayer Task Force, a now infamous unit designed to track down the serial killer targeting black women in South Central. Maybe he found a different outlet for his urges, or maybe he got sick. Hell, maybe he just got lucky and evaded detection. But then you look at the bigger picture, and suddenly, things stop making sense. Because here's the truth, a lot of people don't believe Franklin actually stopped killing. And there's good reason to doubt it. Let's start with the LAPD's incompetence. The murders Franklin committed in the 80s, barely investigated. Detectives admitted that these cases were often classified as runaways or drug-related deaths, meaning there could be dozens, if not hundreds, of missing women that were never linked to him. Then there's his job. Franklin worked as a garbage collector for the city of Los Angeles, a sanitation worker, which means he had access to trash disposal sites, landfills, industrial waste areas. He wouldn't have needed to dump bodies in alleyways anymore. Think about that for a second. For years, Franklin had been leaving bodies in the open, knowing that police weren't really looking into these crimes. But after 1988, he had a new way to make his victims disappear, a way that ensured they were never found. And let's not ignore the numbers. The official tally of Franklin's victims? 10 women and 1 survivor. But that's just the confirmed cases, the ones with DNA evidence, bullet matches, and surviving witnesses. What about the hundreds of women who disappeared during those 14 years? Women who fit the same profile from the same neighborhoods under eerily similar circumstances. The LAPD won't say it, but the evidence speaks for itself. Franklin never stopped. He just stopped leaving bodies behind. Then, in 2002, the killings started again. Same victim type, same method, same dumping grounds. As if he never stopped. So was it really a sleep? Or did the grim sleeper just learn how to make his victims disappear? The resurgence of killings in the early 2000s is widely attributed to a combination of factors that triggered Lonnie Franklin Jr.'s return to his murderous ways. One theory is that he was motivated by a sense of nostalgia for his earlier crimes, which had garnered him notoriety and attention. In 2002, the body of a 15-year-old African-American girl named Mary Lowe was found in an alleyway in South Los Angeles. She had been shot multiple times in the head and torso, and her body had been posed in a manner that seemed to suggest a twisted sense of intimacy. The investigation into Lowe's murder led investigators to discover a second victim, Janisha Campbell, who had gone missing several months prior. Her body was found in a garbage bag on a street in South Los Angeles, bearing the same hallmarks as Lowe's murder: multiple gunshot wounds, and a pose that seemed almost deliberate. As investigators began to piece together the evidence from both murders, they started to notice a disturbing pattern. The victims were all young African-American women, many of whom were sex workers or had been involved in prostitution at some point in their lives. They were all found in similar locations, alleyways and garbage bags, and the wounds inflicted on them suggested a level of cruelty that was almost calculated. 2003, when 2 more bodies were discovered in similar circumstances, that investigators began to suspect that they might be dealing with the same killer from the 1980s. The victims were both women who had been involved in prostitution, and their bodies had been posed in a manner that seemed almost familiar. The forensic evidence from these latest murders linked them directly to the original grim sleeper cases of the 1980s. Hair samples and fibers found on the bodies matched those discovered at the crime scenes of the earlier murders, while DNA analysis revealed a match between the semen collected from one of the victims and a sample taken from Lonnie Franklin Jr.'s home. As investigators slowly pieced together the evidence, they began to realize that they were dealing with a killer who had been active in the 1980s, but had seemingly gone dormant for over a decade. The resumption of killings in the early 2000s seemed almost calculated, as if Franklin had been waiting for the perfect moment to strike again. The discovery of new victims and the forensic evidence that linked them to the original murders was like a puzzle falling into place. Investigators knew they were dealing with a complex and calculating killer who had managed to evade capture for over 2 decades. As the investigation continued, it became clear that Franklin's return to killing was not just a random act of violence. It was a deliberate attempt to reassert his dominance as the grim sleeper. He had waited patiently for the perfect moment to strike again, and when he did so with a level of precision and cruelty that was almost unnerving. For decades, Lonnie Franklin Jr. had been a ghost. The grim sleeper was nothing more than a whisper of a name, a specter haunting South Los Angeles. He had killed with impunity, vanished for years, then returned, and law enforcement had nothing on him. No identity, no witnesses who could name him, no paper trail leading back to a suspect. But DNA doesn't forget. And in 2010, After more than 25 years of dead ends, police finally got the break they had been waiting for. It all started with a controversial technique, a familial DNA search. At the time, this was a new and untested method, and it was considered ethically questionable by many legal experts. The idea was simple. If a killer's DNA wasn't in the system, maybe a family member's was. So, detectives ran the Grim Sleeper's DNA, collected from the bodies of his victims, through California's criminal database. And this time, they got a match. But it wasn't to Franklin himself. It was his son, Christopher Franklin. Christopher had been arrested on a weapons charge, and his DNA had been logged into the state system. While it wasn't an exact match to the Grim Sleeper's DNA, it was close enough to indicate that the killer was a close male relative. This meant one thing: the man they were hunting had to be Christopher's father, uncle, or brother. Detectives zeroed in on Lonnie Franklin Jr. almost immediately. A former garbage collector, backyard mechanic, and neighborhood handyman, Franklin had spent decades living in plain sight. He wasn't a recluse. He wasn't hiding. He was just another guy in South LA, chatting with neighbors, fixing up cars, and even attending block parties, all while carrying the secrets of at least 10 murders. But DNA alone wasn't enough. They needed his DNA, not just his son's. And to get it, they had to be smart. So detectives went undercover. They followed Franklin to a pizza restaurant, carefully watching his every move. And then, as he ate, they waited. When he finished, he tossed a slice of pizza into the trash. That was it. That was all they needed. The moment he left, detectives moved in, collected the discarded crust, and rushed it to the lab. And when they tested it, it was a perfect match. Lonnie Franklin Jr. was the Grim Sleeper. Days later, in July 2010, police moved in. SWAT officers stormed Franklin's house, taking him into custody without incident. But the real horror, it wasn't just Franklin they found. Inside his home, detectives uncovered a nightmare. A hidden world of trophies, evidence, and secrets that had been buried for decades. And what they found inside would change everything. For years, the Grim Sleeper had operated in the dark. He killed in silence, leaving behind scattered bodies, unanswered questions, and families searching for daughters who would never come home. But when detectives finally searched his home, they found something far worse than they had ever imagined. This wasn't just a killer's house. It was a trophy room of terror. Inside, tucked away in drawers, cabinets, old shoeboxes, and even a garage refrigerator, police uncovered over 1,000 photographs. Images of women in various states of vulnerability. Some were smiling, some were asleep, and some looked dead. There were hundreds of Polaroids, some dated, some faded with time. Some showed women fully dressed, while others were nude, unconscious, or barely alive. Some had bruises. Some had eyes half open, as if life had just left their bodies. And others, they were staring directly at the camera, their expressions frozen in fear, as if they knew this photo would be the last thing they ever did. Detectives flipped through image after image, and the deeper they went, the darker it got. These weren't just snapshots, they were souvenirs. And then they found the videotapes, stacks of old VHS tapes, unmarked, shoved into drawers, hidden in plain sight. When they played them, they saw Franklin interacting with some of these women, leading them into secluded areas. There was no footage of him actually murdering anyone, but the context was clear. Many of these women were never seen again. As investigators dug further, they noticed something even more disturbing. Some of the women in these pictures had never been reported missing, which meant one of two things. Either these women survived and never spoke about what happened to them, or they were still out there, hidden, buried, lost forever. One by one, the families of Franklin's known victims were called in. Investigators needed them to go through the photos to see if they recognized anyone. Mothers, sisters, daughters, women who had been missing for decades. And when they did, the room fell silent. Tears, shaking hands, faces turning pale, because some of those women, they were theirs. Women they had searched for, women they had begged the police to find. Women they had prayed would one day walk through the front door, alive. And now, here they were, just another face in a stack of Franklin's personal trophies. But what about the others? Who were they? To this day, dozens of those women remain unidentified. They could be survivors, long-forgotten cases, or Franklin's unknown victims. Women whose bodies were never found, whose names were never spoken, and who, in the eyes of the world, simply vanished. What police found inside Lonnie Franklin Jr.'s home proved what many had feared all along. The Grim Sleeper wasn't just a serial killer. He was a predator who had been hunting for decades. And the true number of his victims? We may never know. The trial of Lonnie Franklin was like a descent into hell. I mean, it's one thing to read about it or watch documentaries, but being there, hearing the testimony from the families of his victims, it was just pure chaos. The prosecution had built up a mountain of evidence against Franklin: DNA samples, fingerprints, eyewitness accounts, you name it. And they presented it all in a way that made it impossible for him to deny his involvement. But what really got under my skin was when they started calling the family members of his victims to take the stand. I mean, can you imagine having to relive the pain and grief of losing a loved one? These people had been through hell, and then they had to face Franklin in court. One woman testified that she recognized her sister's picture on the refrigerator in Franklin's garage. Another victim's family member told the court that she saw her sister with Franklin just hours before she was killed. It was like a never-ending nightmare for these people. And then there was the testimony from the woman who had been gang-raped by Franklin and his accomplices back in 1974. She was visibly shaken as she recounted the details of what happened to her. And Franklin just sat there, expressionless. No remorse, no regret, nothing. The defense strategy was basically to try and discredit the DNA evidence, claiming that it could have been contaminated or planted by the police. But it was a weak argument. The prosecution had done their due diligence on this one. As the jury began deliberating, you could feel the tension in the courtroom. The families of the victims were all huddled together, praying for justice to be served. And then, finally, the verdict came down. Franklin was guilty of 10 counts of murder. But here's the thing, even with a conviction, it didn't bring back their loved ones. It didn't undo the pain and suffering that these families had endured. All it did was give them closure, a sense of justice being served. And as for Franklin, he just sat there, expressionless as ever, like he was watching a movie about someone else's life. The verdict was a major victory for the families of the victims, but it also raised more questions than answers. How many other women did Franklin kill? Who were his accomplices? And why did he do what he did? Franklin wasn't done fighting yet. He filed an automatic appeal, claiming that his constitutional rights had been violated during the trial. But the appeals court rejected his claims, and in 2016 he was formally sentenced to death. And then it's all just a waiting game. Franklin spent years on death row at San Quentin State Prison, fighting for every scrap of attention from the media and the public. He claimed that he was innocent, that the evidence against him was fabricated. But nobody believed him. By March 28, 2020, Franklin was found dead in his cell. And with that, we close our case for today. Hope you enjoyed my attempt at recounting this case, and see you soon.